Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving into a deeply serious, absolutely crucial topic, the realities of sexual aggression and violence. We're going to bypass the noise and look directly at the data, the legal definitions, and the sociological research to really understand what is actually happening in our society, completely separated from the stereotypes.
Right out of the gate, we have to acknowledge the heavy emotional weight of this material. The source text actually hits the nail on the head here, noting that high on the list of feelings you might experience reading about this are anger, fear, sadness, and outrage. And if you're feeling those things as we go through this, those reactions are completely normal and completely understandable. Our goal today isn't just to feel those strong emotions, though. It's to channel them into a rational understanding so we can actually push for meaningful social change.
So here is our roadmap for the explainer. First, we'll start by acknowledging the statistical reality. Then, we'll look at how redefining the crime actually changed our entire understanding of it. After that, we're going to dismantle some seriously pervasive myths, zoom in on the specific environments of campuses and the military, and finally, wrap up with prevention and action.
All right, Section 1, Acknowledging the Reality.
The most crucial thing we need to wrap our heads around is the sheer scale of the problem. This crime is just so much more common than most people realize. We're talking about over half of all women and 1/3 of men having experienced some form of sexual violence in their lifetimes. Just think about that for a second. This isn't some rare anomaly. It's a pervasive issue woven into our society. Even more staggeringly, nearly 1 in 5 women and 1 in 70 men report experiencing rape at least once. It's a huge statistical reality that affects people everywhere. And truly acknowledging these numbers is the absolute first step toward doing anything about it.
Moving to Section 2, Redefining the Crime. Let's see how our legal understanding has shifted.
For literally decades, law enforcement operated under a really narrow definition of rape. The 1927 FBI definition was strictly limited to, quote, carnal knowledge of a female forcibly and against her will. But thankfully, society's understanding broadened over time. In 2013, the FBI finally implemented a new definition, the penetration, no matter how slight, without the consent of the victim. This modernized update was a game changer because it recognized that forced sex involves all sorts of acts, it isn't limited by gender, and most importantly, it centers entirely on the absence of consent. And the impact of simply changing those words was immediate. If you look at the statistics, there is a massive jump between 2012, where reported cases hovered around 84,000, and 2013, which suddenly saw over 113,000 reported cases. Now, the crime didn't just magically skyrocket overnight. What happened was the system finally started counting a broader, much more accurate reality of what victims had actually been experiencing the whole time.
So the absolute core of identifying any sexual assault comes down to one word: consent. It is a voluntary, verbal agreement between adults to engage in a specific act. Any non-consensual sexual penetration, and that means physical force, the threat of bodily harm, or incapacitation with drugs or alcohol, is rape. It is entirely the presence or absence of that voluntary agreement that legally and morally defines the act. There is zero gray area when that agreement is missing.
Now, what is truly shocking is how recently the law actually applied this concept of consent to marriage. Incredibly, it wasn't until 1996 that rape in the context of marriage became illegal in all 50 U.S. states. 1996! And even today, there are still certain jurisdictions that hold legal exceptions for marital rape. It is a really stark reminder of how archaic ideas about ownership and marriage have stubbornly lingered in our legal codes.
Section 3, Dismantling Pervasive Myths. This is where we separate deeply ingrained stereotypes from actual hard data.
We have all heard of the stranger danger myth, right? The idea that a rapist is a masked stranger hiding in a dark alleyway. Well, the actual data completely shatters that idea. Over 51% of sexual assaults are committed by intimate partners, and nearly 41% by acquaintances. Only 13.8% are committed by complete strangers. The data tells us loud and clear that attackers are overwhelmingly people the victim already knows and trusts.
There are a bunch of other incredibly harmful myths we have got to dismantle. You know the ones. The horrible idea that victims ask for it by how they dress, that men just lose control of their urges, or even that women secretly want to be overpowered. Expert consensus proves exactly the opposite. Rape is rarely actually about sex. It is fundamentally a brutal crime of violence, power, control, and humiliation. Understanding that specific motivation is absolutely vital to changing how society views both the person committing the crime and the survivor. And the fear of this crime creates this heavy, invisible weight.
When you ask women what daily precautions they take to avoid sexual assault, they rattle off a massive list. Locking doors immediately, checking under cars, monitoring their drinks, constantly altering their jogging routes, carrying their keys between their fingers like a weapon. The list for men? It's virtually non-existent. This perfectly illustrates the immense, everyday psychological burden that women carry just to navigate the world.
At the same time, we absolutely have to talk about the reality of male victims. Like we noted earlier, 1 in 70 men experience rape, and it's most often perpetrated by other men. Male survivors face these unique societal stigmas that severely limit their reporting of the crime. They're actually at a higher risk for physical injury, and they frequently carry deep, silent feelings of guilt, shame, and confusion, which makes them far less likely to seek out the physical or psychological help they need.
All right, Section 4, campuses and the military. Let's look at how this plays out in highly structured environments.
Rape and sexual assault are a widespread, serious crisis on college campuses. The numbers show that 1 in 5 women will experience at least one completed sexual assault during their college years. And again, totally mirroring the broader data we just looked at, stranger rape is incredibly uncommon here. It is almost always a fellow student or an acquaintance.
So on campuses, a huge part of the conversation revolves around incapacitation. Incapacitated rape happens when a person is rendered unable to take defensive action. Now, while date rape drugs definitely exist and are incredibly dangerous, alcohol is by far the primary weapon used in college rapes. Perpetrators intentionally use alcohol to exploit a potential victim's vulnerability, and then they turn around and use that same alcohol to excuse their own violent behavior. What's even worse is that victims who are drinking are tragically often viewed as less credible.
We also see severe institutional blind spots. Research shows that some fraternities and men's athletic programs can harbor what sociologists call a culture of rape, heavily buying into those terrible myths we discussed earlier. The military struggles immensely with this too, mostly due to an ingrained culture of protecting our own. When an assault is investigated by a soldier's own chain of command, victims are understandably terrified to come forward. They fear blame, isolation, or direct retaliation from their peers and superiors.
Finally, Section 5, prevention and action. Because understanding the problem is only half the battle. The single greatest obstacle to stopping sexual violence is underreporting. If we don't have accurate statistics, institutions aren't going to allocate the resources to fight it, which lulls us all into a completely false sense of security. But here is perhaps the most chilling takeaway from all the research. Men who rape rarely do so only once. Think about that. If a perpetrator isn't reported and held accountable, they are highly likely to become a serial offender, just moving on to victimize someone else.
Now, we can't just profile someone by looking at them, but there are absolutely some major behavioral red flags to watch out for. You should be highly cautious if someone displays an intense need to dominate or control a situation, if they're emotionally abusive, exhibit extreme, irrational jealousy, or use even minor physical violence. Things like bullying others or cruelty to animals and children are also massive red flags for someone who inherently seeks to overpower and victimize the people around them.
If the unthinkable happens and an assault does occur, taking immediate action is critical, no matter how unbelievably difficult it is in that moment. For many survivors, the very first human instinct is to withdraw, to deny it, and to desperately want a shower to wash away the trauma. But experts stress 2 absolutely vital steps. First, report the assault to the authorities immediately. Second, preserve the evidence. As agonizing as it is, resisting the urge to bathe or change clothes is completely crucial for a forensic exam so they can build a concrete case against the attacker.
I want to leave you with this final thought. Right now, women carry an exhausting, massive daily burden of precautions just to avoid being assaulted. So how can we, as a society, shift that burden completely away from the potential victims and place it squarely where it belongs, on the absolute accountability of the perpetrators and the institutions that so often shelter them? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.